All right, so over the weekend we had CPAC take place, which I think is the largest conservative political conference of the year, and we had a whole wide cast of absolutely deranged characters who were getting up and giving speeches for this conference, including, I think we had Donald Trump, I think they invited Mike Lindell, we had, of course, a bunch of political commentators as well, like the guy who we are about to watch in this clip, Michael Knowles from the Daily Wire, who has some pretty insane takes on Transgenderism is what he's going to call it in this clip. So let's just go ahead and jump into this, and I will let it speak for itself, and then we'll come out the other side and try to break it down a little bit.
There can be no middle way in dealing with transgenderism. It is all or nothing. If transgenderism is true, if men really can become women, then it's true for everybody of all ages. If transgenderism is false, as it is, if men really can't become women, as they cannot, then it's false for everybody too. And if it's false, then we should not indulge it, especially since that indulgence requires taking away the rights and customs of so many people. If it is false, then for the good of society, and especially for the good of the poor people who have fallen prey to this confusion, transgenderism must be eradicated from public life entirely. The whole preposterous ideology at every level.
Okay, so again, speaks for itself, particularly at the end where he calls for the complete societal eradication of transgenderism. Now, keep in mind, when he uses the term transgenderism, he's just talking about the, I guess, belief he would classify it as, that trans people exist within society, okay? That's really all that it is. Now, he would add on a bunch of other things like drag shows and, these book readings that happen with performers sometimes and all of these different other tangential things. But at the core of it, that's what he's talking about. They do not believe that trans people can exist. They basically classify it as some sort of a disease or a mental illness that, in his words, needs to be eradicated. Okay, so with that being said, all right, I think anybody who is, interpreting that in a good faith way would understand exactly what he was calling for there, right? This is why I've said previously that a lot of these conservative political commentators, especially guys like Michael Knowles or Matt Walsh as well, that they're using genocidal rhetoric, right? This is the language of genocides, right? That doesn't mean that I believe they're literally building a death camp right now and they're going to be shipping off LGBTQ people to the death camps any day. It's just pointing out that if you look at the historical precedent on this issue, how this type of language has been deployed against minority communities within many different societies, this tracks, okay? So this is why I refer to this as genocidal rhetoric. Now, he pushed back pretty strongly to allegations that he was calling to eradicate trans people instead of just transgenderism, whatever that amorphous term means in his mind, and we're going to get to that here in a second. But again, I just want to hammer home that, like, something that these people never bring up for some reason, and trying to push this idea that, oh, trans people didn't exist a couple decades ago and this is this new fad that's just been sprung on society, that is just simply not true, okay? Transgendered people, by different names in different societies, have existed for essentially the entirety of recorded human history, okay? That is not something that just sprung out of nowhere, right? The same way that gay people have existed for the entirety of society, right? These are normal human things, right? This is not some sort of like an aberration. We just happen to have recently gotten ourselves within society to a slightly more, accepting place where more trans people are able to identify with themselves how they actually want to and are able to, more adequately express that in society, right? That's what we're talking about here. We're not talking about some sort of like massive new wave of something that has never existed before, but that's how they want to talk about this, and that's what they want people to believe, that it is not something that is innate to who these people are, but it is instead some sort of like a, threat to the country, because in a couple of years, if we stay on this current trajectory, everybody's kids are going to be trans or something like that, right? So with that being laid out there, now we get to this. Okay, so the media obviously responded in many different outlets to this insane tirade that Michael Knowles just went on right there, and they covered it, I think, fairly accurately. They say here from the Rolling Stone, CPAC speaker calls for transgender people to be eradicated, and they give the quote of exactly what he said. Now listen, he pushes back on this, and he basically says, this headline is libelous and I demand a retraction. Okay, so classic conservative snowflake here, right? Immediately freaking out and threatening to like try to sue the Rolling Stone over their headline choice here. But I mean, he's saying that it's libelous. Okay, so in other words, he's saying that they're knowingly basically pushing a false narrative about something that he didn't actually say or was not the actual point of what he was saying or the right framing or whatever it may be, right? But I mean, look at what they're saying here. CPAC speaker calls for transgender people to be eradicated. Now, he would say again that he was calling for transgenderism to be eradicated, but how exactly do you eradicate so-called transgenderism, whatever that means, without removing trans people from the equation? Are you saying that they shouldn't be able to engage in public life in any capacity? I mean, that's what he said there, right? He says eradicated from public life entirely. Okay, so how exactly do you do that with transgenderism, whatever that means, without removing trans people from the equation? It doesn't make any sense. These are synonymous. You're just using slightly different words to stand in place for what is the inevitable implication of what you're actually arguing here. Now, the Rolling Stone actually did end up changing their headline in response to this pushback and these threats coming from him, but I think that they did a pretty good job in, sort of staying on the same framing that they were initially going with, that being the ongoing threat to trans people in this country, as we've had just a massive wave of dozens, if not hundreds, of pieces of legislation around the country that have been introduced to try to oppress LGBTQ people, but specifically the weight has been pushed on trans people, especially through legislation. But they push back on this sort of narrativizing here from Michael Knowles and his, pretend dance around as if he didn't actually say what he definitely said and we all just watched on camera. But they say in the headline, CPAC speaker calls for the eradication of transgenderism and somehow claims that he's not calling for elimination of transgender people. Okay, so what are they saying here? So they say, Aaron Reed, a transgender rights activist and writer, tells Rolling Stone that it is an absurd distinction. There is no difference between a ban on transgenderism and an attack on transgender people, she says. Absolutely correct. They are one and the same, and there's no separation between them. Knowles and others at the Daily Wire, including anti-trans activist Matt Walsh, are not just talking about keeping transgender people out of public life, they're actively working to make it happen. She noted their support for bills to deprive transgender people of gender-affirming medical care, bans on using public bathrooms, and targeting of live performances by trans individuals, saying, if you try to separate us from all the things that allow people to exist in the world, that does amount to banning transgender people's existence. Exactly. And she says, you can't go your whole life without using the bathroom, without telling a joke on stage in front of friends, without your medicine. All of that amounts to a ban on transgender people. And again, she's 100% correct on this take. An analogy that you could fairly use in this circumstance, because we're talking about a class of people, okay? An analogy would be if he were to get up there and say, I am calling for the complete eradication of Judaism from the United States. Now, most people would look at that and say, this guy's a Nazi, okay? Right? He's calling to eradicate Jewish people from society. He said Judaism, but what is the implication of that, right? You are targeting a specific group of people, right? Same thing applies for this situation, but they've been trying to respond to this, and their analogies that they've been trying to use are just completely fucking insane. Of course, so here's the defense, right? So we had this initial tweet, I don't know who this person is, Reverend Dr. Jaquie Lewis, and she's had, a pretty good take here, and he responded to it, but she said, I just dream about a world where we spend the amount of energy, time, and money we currently waste on bigotry to eradicate things like poverty, homelessness, hunger, and medical debt. Good take there, right? No, not according to Michael Knowles here. He says, are you calling for a genocide of the poor? Okay, so he's trying to equate these two things, right? Calling to eradicate a class of people, that being transgender people or transgenderism, from society, and he's equating that to trying to, what? Reduce poverty in the United States, eradicate poverty in the United States. Listen, I mean, this is obviously all bad faith, dance around bullshit posturing that he's doing here because he knows exactly what he meant, and what he said in that clip. But I mean, again, the comparison here is just completely ridiculous. Everybody knows what we mean when we're talking about eradicating poverty or homelessness or hunger and medical debt. We're talking about leftist economic policies in order to materially uplift people that are on the bottom rung of society. That's what we're talking about. When you're talking about eliminating transgenderism, what are you talking about? Okay, are you talking about policies to uplift people in the United States? No, you're talking about discriminating through legislation, through ongoing attacks on this community, trying to legislate them out of existence, okay? That's what you're doing. You're targeting a class of people, not some sort of a socioeconomic political issue, right? I mean, it's just completely insane. But a lot of conservatives have actually been siding with Michael Knowles on this. I mean, not surprisingly, but a lot of people have been siding with even his pushback to the idea that he was using genocidal language, which everybody understands is exactly what he was doing. So there's your update right now. I mean, obviously this comes again as we have hundreds and hundreds of pieces of legislation around the country that are specifically aimed directly at the trans community, LGBTQ people more broadly. So, I mean, this type of rhetoric, again, stand firmly in my classification of it as genocidal rhetoric, because that is the implication of what they are actually calling for here. But, you know, watching some of these speeches at CPAC, seeing what a lot of these political commentators, the type of language that they have been using recently, we are definitely headed to, pretty scary times here.
Everyone is saying good politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying